thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Secretary. The race of Ukraine's gains and the rate of those gains has really been picking up. It's been striking, happening all across several regions as we take another broad look at the map. And this is all in just a few short weeks, even in the last few days. This was against Russia's trained military. Will more numbers, once Russia's new conscripts are deployed, make much of a difference?
Well, without question, the tide of war has turned in Ukraine, and Putin is failing in his efforts. I think the Ukrainians have developed well-planned initiatives here that are moving into the east as well as the south. There's a multiple-pronged initiative that's going on here, and the Russians, frankly, are not standing up. They're basically depleted, and they're falling back. So I think we are looking at clearly continuing effort by Ukraine to push the Russians out of their country.
How important is the timing of these Ukrainian advances up here, down here in the south, especially before winter, when the battlefield will literally change?
I think it's extremely important. Russia just went through the act of pretending to annex those areas, now appointing new heads of those various areas. But the bottom line is they're not in control. They're not in control. Even though their forces are depleted now, and they do have the possibility of trying to apply some of their newly mobilized forces, I think the problem is that they're failing at that as well. I mean, they're fighting a two-front war, not only in Ukraine, but in Russia. And they're finding it very difficult to be able to mobilize individuals. And they're talking about training them by putting them on a shooting range for a little while and throwing them into combat. They will not be properly prepared for combat. So I think Ukraine has a clear advantage right now in terms of this war.
Zelensky says Ukraine will not stop until it retakes all Ukrainian land, including Crimea, which was annexed in 2014. What do you think? Is Crimea in play here?
I think President Zelensky is the one to make that decision. It is his country. Ukraine did consist of the Crimea as well as these other areas that the Russians are claiming is now part of Russia. We know that Ukraine has put up a very courageous fight for their country, and they're going to continue to do it. So I think there's no question that Ukraine has the advantage now. But we also shouldn't kid ourselves. There's probably a lot of fighting that still remains. Some of these areas are going to be more difficult to be able to take. But right now, there's no question that they have the advantage.
Is there a scenario you can see where Putin can lose this war but stay in power?
I do not see Putin being able to remain in power unless he can claim some kind of phony victory in Ukraine. And that would mean that he'd have to take an off-ramp very soon that would allow him to try to maintain some control of some of the areas that are there. But my sense is that Putin is not willing to negotiate at this point. My intelligence friends all make clear that Putin will continue to double down. And ultimately, what that means is that we are still going to have a prolonged war in the Ukraine. Hopefully, the Ukrainians can ultimately push the Russians out of Ukraine. That probably is the principal goal right now.
Right, but would Putin ever accept defeat or accept scaling his objectives back? Or is this, you know, I think at the back of my mind, we all worry what could come if he is forced to do something more drastic than he's done at this point in order to not accept defeat. What does that look like? Are you worried about nukes?
Well, look, there's only one thing that Putin understands. He's not somebody who's interested in diplomacy. He's not interested in negotiation. the only way to deal with Putin is by force. And that's exactly what the Ukrainians are doing, which means they're going to continue this effort to try to push the Russians out. At some point, Putin has to make a decision whether or not he is going to try to find an off-ramp to be able to protect some semblance of a victory there that he can proclaim, or whether he's going to be defeated. If he is totally defeated, then I don't see any way that Putin can survive in Russia. So the real question is whether Putin wants to survive or whether he wants to ultimately end his regime.
This coming from a man who has met with Putin face to face, former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta. Thank you so much for taking time to join us today.
Well, our correspondent CNN's Frederick Plackton is in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, and joins us now live. Good to have you with us, Fred. So Ukraine's forces are certainly pushing ahead with their counteroffensive. Russian forces seeming on the verge of collapse in Kherson. Should Ukraine take that back, what would it mean? Would it shift the momentum further?
Oh, I think it would definitely shift the momentum further. And I think, what we're seeing right now is already a huge shift in momentum, because one of the things that we've been talking about over the past, let's say, maybe 2.5 months is a small Ukrainian counteroffensive in some smaller pockets of the front line. But what we're seeing right now is Ukrainian counteroffensives in large parts of the areas where the Russian forces and the Ukrainians meet on the front line. You're talking about the east and the south as well. And if you look at that map in front of us, there's really large areas where the Ukrainian forces are advancing. The east, for instance, we've been talking in the past couple of days about the town of Liman, which was a really important logistics hub for the Russians. The Ukrainians took that back and have now managed to push on several kilometers from there, they have said, and take over other areas there, which obviously on the one hand makes it more difficult for the Russians to conduct their own logistics, because a lot of their logistics lines are now within artillery range of the Ukrainians, and then also obviously allows the Ukrainians to push further towards those Russian defensive lines. But the big story, and I think the one that's been really surprising for a lot of people, has been the one in the south, where late last night the Ukrainians were saying that they were making huge gains in that area, winning back a lot of very important villages and towns as they try to move further south towards that town of Kherson, which is obviously a very important one. But Linda, one of the things that we also have to mention is that the Russians are still shooting back. One thing that happened overnight here is that the Russians used kamikaze drones, the Ukrainians say, possibly supplied by Iran, to hit an area, or to hit a town that's only about 50 miles from where I am right now, called Bila Tserkva. That caused huge damage there in some areas of that place. So certainly still a very dangerous conflict, but right now the Ukrainians clearly believe that the momentum is on their side, Linda.
And Fred, it's certainly interesting when you hear from Moscow officials who admit they still are not sure where the borders are in these regions that they've claimed to illegally annex. And also 8 months into the war, we've heard from a top Russian war correspondent who's now acknowledging the losses.
Yeah, certainly. And it's really a shift in the rhetoric that we're seeing, especially on Russian state TV. I've been watching a lot of it over the past couple of months since all of this has been going on several stints to Moscow as well. And one of the things that we've always heard is about Russian advances, about their military, how well they're doing here in Ukraine. That certainly seems to be a lot more muted now. Indeed, that correspondent and some other people as well on government TV, some hosts also, talking about the fact that right now it's very difficult for the Russians on the front lines, on the battlefields, and also saying that the mobilization that has taken place so far by the Russians, the defense minister, of course, saying that they mobilized around 200,000 people to take part in the Russian armed forces, that's not going to make a difference on the battlefield until at least a couple of weeks from now, if not more than that. So certainly they're acknowledging it's a very difficult situation. But I think one of the other things that you just said is also very remarkable as well, that the Russians so far have not said what exactly the borders of these annexed territories that they claim to have annexed, what the borders of those are going to be. And it was interesting because CNN actually asked the spokesman for the Kremlin today, and he said he would leave that question unanswered for now, and said he does believe the Russians will be able to take some of that territory back. But right now, things certainly seem to be going in the other direction, Linda.